Imagine standing in the glittering halls of Versailles in 1786, where what you see will haunt you forever. Behind a silk tapestry, you hear the muffled screams of a child, no older than 12, while France's most powerful nobles take turns in what they call their evening entertainment. Laughter mixes with cries as duchesses bet on how long the child will last. This isn't some dark fairy tale. This is real, recorded in the courts that ruled over 25 million French people. You think you know about noble excess, about the luxury that sparked revolution. But what you're about to learn makes Marie Antoinette's cake obsession seem like a kid's game. The French aristocracy didn't just waste money while peasants starved. They built a system of abuse so twisted that when revolutionaries found the proof, even hardened executioners cried. This is the hidden story of how France's elite turned cruelty into high art, children into objects, and suffering into noble amusement. The Palace of Versailles in the 1780s was seen as Europe's greatest achievement. Foreign leaders gasped at halls covered in gold, gardens stretching for miles, and wigs worth more than a peasant's lifetime earnings. But beneath this dazzling surface was a world of rot, spreading through every part of noble life. The French upper class had done something rare in history. They made evil not just accepted but admired as the height of culture. What started as rich boredom grew into complex schemes that destroyed thousands while entertaining Europe's most powerful. The face of this corruption was Louis-François Armand de Vignerot du Plessis, the Duke of Richelieu, grandnephew of the famous cardinal. By 1750, Richelieu was the king of noble vice. His tastes were so infamous that others traveled Europe just to see his invention. Records call him charming, brilliant, and utterly without conscience, the perfect symbol of nobles who mistook cruelty for class. Richelieu's daily life shows how calculated this evil was. Each morning, servants brought him a menu, lists of victims, their ages, skills, and condition. Like a food lover picking wine, he'd choose based on mood, weather, or whatever excuse amused him. But Richelieu was just the start. The Duke of Orleans ran his academy, a Paris mansion where children as young as 8 were trained for service. Madame de Pompadour, known as Louis XV's elegant mistress, ran networks supplying the court with fresh victims on schedule. This nightmare didn't happen overnight. It grew from generations of idle wealth, unchecked power, and a philosophy that confused cleverness with heartlessness. They told themselves their crimes were advanced, that morals were for the poor, and that their bloodline let them treat people as toys. But what you've heard so far is nothing next to the horrors they built once they turned their sins into a system. The change came in 1748 with the Society of Philosophical Libertines, founded by the Duke of Orleans and other high nobles. The society wasn't just a social club, it was a criminal organization dedicated to pushing the boundaries of exploitation while maintaining a veneer of intellectual respectability. The society operated from a mansion in the Faubourg Saint-Germain district of Paris, hidden behind walls that concealed activities so extreme that even corrupt police officials refused bribes to look the other way. Members included some of the most powerful names in France: dukes, marquises, high-ranking clergy, and wealthy merchants who paid enormous fees for the privilege of participating in what they called philosophical experimentation. The society's charter, discovered during the revolution in a hidden vault, reveals the systematic nature of their operations. They maintained detailed records of victims, categorized by age, gender, physical characteristics, and what they euphemistically called specialized training. They operated procurement networks that extended across Europe, with agents in major cities whose sole job was identifying and acquiring suitable subjects for aristocratic entertainment. The mansion itself was designed specifically for its horrific purpose. The main floor featured elegant salons where members would discuss philosophy and literature, while selecting their evening's entertainment from catalogs that read like livestock inventories. The basement levels contained what they called preparation chamber, where victims were trained, experimentation rooms equipped with devices that belonged in torture chambers rather than bedrooms, and recovery areas where those who survived the evening's activities could heal enough to be used again. The society's most innovative contribution to aristocratic depravity was the systemization of what they called philosophical cruelty. Members weren't just interested in sexual gratification, they wanted to explore the philosophical implications of absolute power over other human beings. They kept detailed journals of their experiments, recording not just what they did to their victims, but how the experience affected their own intellectual and emotional development. These journals, written in elegant French and bound in leather that cost more than most people's annual income, describe scenes of such calculated brutality that revolutionary prosecutors struggled to read them aloud during trial. One member wrote extensively about his theory that inflicting suffering on children was actually a form of education, preparing them for the harsh realities of life while providing valuable insights into the nature of power and submission. But the society's most horrific innovation was yet to come: the creation of what they called living art. The society's members, bored by conventional perversion, began experimenting with what they called living art, elaborate theatrical productions where victims became unwilling performers in scenarios designed to combine exploitation with aesthetic experience. These weren't spontaneous acts of cruelty, but carefully choreographed performances that required months of preparation and involved dozens of participants. The most famous of these productions was the Duke of Orleans' Garden of Earthly Delights, a recreation of the famous painting by Hieronymus Bosch, using human beings. Children and young adults were positioned throughout a specially designed garden setting, their bodies painted and modified to match the nightmarish imagery of Bosch's masterpiece. Society members would stroll through this living tableau, interacting with the human figures while discussing the philosophical implications of transforming art into reality. The preparation for these productions was as horrific as the events themselves. Victims were kept in specially designed chambers for weeks or months, their bodies gradually modified to match the artistic vision. Some were starved to achieve specific body shapes. Others were subjected to procedures that changed their appearance in permanent ways. The society maintained a staff of what they called artistic consultants, essentially torture specialists with backgrounds in painting and sculpture, who knew how to modify human bodies to achieve desired aesthetic effects. The Marquise de Montenot, despite her public reputation for piety, created what she called sacred mysteries, religious-themed productions that combined Christian imagery with exploitation. Children would be dressed as angels while being subjected to acts that were presented as religious ceremonies. Society members would participate while wearing clerical robes, creating blasphemous parodies of Catholic rituals that satisfied both their appetites and their desire to mock conventional morality. These productions became legendary throughout European aristocratic circles. Wealthy nobles would travel from as far as Russia and England to attend performances, bringing their own victims as gifts for the society and commissioning custom productions featuring their particular interests. The society developed a thriving international business with branches in major European capitals and regular exchanges of both victims and creative ideas. The documentation of these activities, preserved in society archives that survived the revolution, reads like a manual for systematic human degradation disguised as high culture. Members kept detailed artistic notes about their productions, critiquing each other's work and suggesting improvements for future performances. They developed elaborate rating systems for evaluating both the aesthetic success of their productions and the quality of suffering they were able to generate. But even the society's organized depravity was just preparation for what happened when aristocratic perversion gained royal approval. The transformation of aristocratic perversion from private vice into state policy began when Louis XV explicitly endorsed what he called the philosophical exploration of human nature. In 1762, the king, inspired by his own involvement with the society, issued secret orders that essentially legalized aristocratic exploitation as long as it was conducted under the guise of philosophical research. This royal approval transformed the scattered perversions of individual aristocrats into a systematic network that reached into every level of French society. The king established what he called the Bureau of Philosophical Studies, a government department whose official purpose was advancing human knowledge, but whose real function was coordinating aristocratic access to victims while ensuring their activities remained secret. The Bureau operated with the efficiency of any other government agency, but its bureaucracy was dedicated to facilitating horrors that would have shocked medieval torture. They maintained detailed records of available victims, organized transportation networks for moving people between aristocratic estates, and provided legal protection for nobles whose activities resulted in inconvenient deaths or injury. Under royal protection, aristocratic perversion reached levels of organization and scale that would have been impossible for private individuals to achieve. The Duke of Orleans expanded his operations to include multiple facilities across France, each specializing in different forms of exploitation. The Marquis de Pompadour established training facilities where children were systematically prepared for aristocratic service. Even relatively minor nobles began maintaining private facilities, secure in the knowledge that royal approval made them untouchable. The international implications were staggering. French aristocrats began hosting exchange programs with their counterparts in other countries, sharing victims and techniques while spreading their innovations across European high society. The French court became a pilgrimage destination for wealthy perverts from across the continent, all eager to experience the sophisticated depravities that royal approval had made possible. The Bureau's most significant contribution was the creation of what they called systematic documentation, detailed records of aristocratic activities that were ostensibly maintained for philosophical research, but actually served as blackmail material to ensure continued cooperation from participants. These records, filling dozens of volumes that survived the revolution, provide a window into organized exploitation on a scale that dwarfs anything in recorded history. The documentation reveals that by 1770, the network of aristocratic exploitation included over 300 active participants across France, with affiliated operations in most major European capitals. They were processing thousands of victims annually, maintaining facilities that resembled industrial operations more than the private indulgences of wealthy individuals. But the royal approval that enabled this systematic horror also contained the seeds of its own destruction. The systematic nature of aristocratic perversion created logistical challenges that eventually exposed the entire network to revolutionary justice. By 1780, the scale of their operations required infrastructure that was impossible to hide from an increasingly angry population that was watching their children disappear while aristocrats lived in unprecedented luxury. The procurement networks that supplied victims to aristocratic facilities relied on poverty and desperation that reached crisis levels in the decade before the revolution. Families facing starvation would sell children to recruiters who promised domestic service positions, but delivered them to facilities where they would never be seen again. The volume of these transactions created a missing persons crisis that eventually drew attention from revolutionary investigators. The financial records of aristocratic perversion reveal spending that would have shocked even the extravagant court of Versailles. The Duke of Orleans alone spent over 2 million livres annually on his facilities, enough money to feed thousands of starving families. When revolutionaries discovered these expenditures in seized financial documents, the public reaction was explosive. The discovery of the Society's archives in 1792 provided revolutionary prosecutors with documentation of crimes so extensive and systematic that many refused to believe the evidence was genuine. The records included not just names and activities, but financial accounts, correspondence with international partners, and detailed descriptions of facilities that read like blueprints for industrial-scale human exploitation. The trials that followed revealed a network of complicity that extended throughout French society. Nobles who had considered themselves above the law suddenly found themselves facing prosecutors who had spent months reading their own words describing the horrors they had inflicted. The contrast between their elegant self-justifications and the brutal reality of their actions created a public relations disaster that helped justify the extreme measures of the terror period. Many aristocrats, faced with certain execution, chose suicide rather than public exposure of their activities. The Duke of Orleans, realizing that his extensive records made defense impossible, took poison in his cell the night before his trial was scheduled to begin. The Marquise de Montano fled to England, but was found dead in her London residence, apparently having overdosed on laudanum rather than face extradition. The international implications were equally dramatic. European aristocrats who had participated in French networks found themselves under investigation in their home countries. The detailed records maintained by the Bureau of Philosophical Studies included correspondence with nobles across the continent, creating diplomatic crises as governments struggled to distance themselves from their own complicit aristocrats. The systematic destruction of evidence by fleeing aristocrats created gaps in the historical record that historians have struggled to fill. Entire libraries of documentation were burned, facilities were dismantled, and participants scattered across Europe carrying secrets they would take to their graves. But enough evidence survived to reveal the true scope of what French aristocrats had created in their pursuit of philosophical entertainment. The French aristocracy's systematic transformation of perversion into high culture represents one of history's most complete examples of how absolute power corrupts absolute. What began as individual vice evolved into organized exploitation that consumed thousands of victims while entertaining the people who controlled the fate of 20. The philosophical justifications aristocrats created for their behavior reveal how intellectual sophistication can be weaponized to justify any atrocity. They convinced themselves that their exploitation of others was actually a form of advanced thinking, that conventional morality was ignorance, and that their superior breeding gave them the right to treat other humans as objects for experimentation. The systematic nature of their operations demonstrates how quickly private vice can become institutional evil when it receives official sanction. Royal approval transformed scattered individual perversions into a coordinated network that operated with government efficiency, while maintaining absolute secrecy through blackmail and mutual complicity. The ultimate irony is that the very excesses aristocrats thought proved their superiority actually demonstrated their complete moral bankruptcy. While they debated philosophy and created elaborate justifications, they were systematically destroying the social fabric that supported their own power. The revolution that eventually consumed them wasn't just about economic inequality. It was about moral outrage at a ruling class that had confused civilization with sophisticated brutality. The surviving documentation provides a warning about what happens when power faces no effective constraints. These French aristocrats weren't uniquely evil. They were ordinary people corrupted by absolute authority and the philosophical frameworks they created to justify using that authority without limit. Understanding their systematic descent into institutionalized perversion helps explain not just the French Revolution, but the recurring historical pattern where ruling elites create elaborate justifications for behavior that would be recognized as criminal if committed by anyone else.